They weren't found right away. The farm sat quiet for 3 full days, its gates open, animals fed, lights turned on at night as if life inside continued normally. Neighbors later said that was the most unsettling part, not the deaths themselves, but the illusion that nothing was wrong. When police finally entered the house, they realized something worse than murder had happened. Whoever killed the family didn't run. He stayed. He cooked meals in their kitchen, slept in their beds, showered, changed clothes. He walked the fields at dawn and watched the sun rise over land that no longer belonged to anyone alive. And before leaving, he wrote a letter. Not a confession, not an apology. A letter explaining why the house still felt occupied. Investigators would later admit this case disturbed even the most experienced officers. Not because of brutality, but because of intimacy. The killer didn't act in rage or panic. He acted with patience, familiarity, and an understanding of the family that suggested something far deeper than opportunity. This was not a random crime. It was a correction. Tonight's story isn't about how a wealthy family died. It's about how someone who knew their routines, their silences, and their secrets erased them, and lived among the aftermath as if he had earned the right. Because when police finally read the letter he left behind, they realized the most terrifying truth of all. The killer believed he belonged there. And for days, no one questioned it. This case didn't shock the country because of violence. It shocked investigators because of what came after. A wealthy family, known in the region for keeping to themselves, was found murdered inside their own farm home. No signs of forced entry, no neighbors reported screams, no alarms, no rushed escape. Instead, police discovered something far more disturbing. Someone had continued living there. Food in the refrigerator had been eaten. Coffee cups were washed and placed back in the cabinet. Fresh footprints appeared in the mud behind the barn, days after the estimated time of death. This wasn't a killer trying to disappear. This was someone trying to remain. Tonight's story takes us deep into a crime that unfolded inside a family structure, where familiarity became access and silence became protection. It's about wealth, isolation, resentment, and a person who crossed the line between guest and executioner, and then behaved as if nothing had changed. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you're drawn to true stories involving family crimes, hidden motives, and cases where the truth is more unsettling than fiction. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Different places, different families, but crimes like this reveal how danger often comes from inside the circle, not outside it. As this story unfolds, you'll see how the killer's days on the farm reveal details the police never expected, and how a single letter left behind would later expose a motive that no one had considered. Because in crimes within families, the most frightening part is rarely the violence itself. It's how easily someone can belong until they decide you no longer should. The family had lived on that farm long before anyone started calling them wealthy. Their money didn't come from sudden success or public deals. It came from land passed down quietly, contracts inherited rather than negotiated, and decades of knowing when to stay invisible. In the region, their name carried weight, but not familiarity. People knew of them, not with them. They liked it that way. The farmhouse stood alone at the end of a dirt road that discouraged visitors by design. Trees absorbed sound, fields created distance. Even on clear days, the house seemed slightly removed from time, as if it belonged to a slower rhythm than the world around it. That isolation became protection, and eventually it became a mistake. When police later reconstructed the days surrounding the murders, they discovered something unsettling. Nothing about the property's routine had changed in a way that alarmed anyone. Deliveries continued, animals were fed, lights turned on at night, smoke rose from the chimney, life appeared uninterrupted. The first night after the murders, a farm supplier drove past the property and saw a man near the barn. He didn't stop. He didn't question it. Someone was always around, he assumed. Someone always had been. The second day, a neighboring farmer noticed the gate open longer than usual. He considered calling, then didn't. Wealthy families had their own schedules, their own reasons. On the third day, a utility worker heard music coming faintly from the house, low, indistinct, not loud enough to demand attention. By the time police arrived, the killer had already lived there longer than the victims had been dead. Inside the house, the crime scene told a story that didn't match the delay in discovery. There was no sign of panic, no evidence of people running from room to room. Each victim had been confronted separately in places where they felt safe enough to let their guard down. The timing suggested patience. The killer had waited. He hadn't rushed from one room to the next. He had moved through the house as if following a mental schedule only he understood. Forensics later confirmed that the murders did not occur all at once. There were gaps, hours between events, enough time for the killer to sit down, to think, to adjust. Afterward, he didn't flee. He didn't hide evidence in a frantic attempt to escape. He washed dishes, he cooked meals, he slept. Investigators found signs of habitation everywhere. The refrigerator showed missing items consumed after the estimated time of death. Pots had been used, cleaned and returned. Coffee cups bore fresh residue. In one bedroom, the bed was made differently than the others. Sheets changed. A pillow positioned with care. In the bathroom, towels were damp. The mirror wiped. The killer hadn't simply stayed, he had settled. This detail disturbed investigators more than any physical evidence. Crimes driven by fear leave traces of urgency. Crimes driven by rage leave disorder. This crime showed comfort. The person responsible moved through the house without hesitation. He knew where things were kept. He knew which doors creaked and which didn't. He knew how to avoid leaving obvious marks. He behaved like someone who believed he belonged there. As police began compiling a list of people with access to the farm, one pattern emerged quickly. The family rarely allowed outsiders inside the house. Workers stayed near the barn. Deliveries were handled at the gate. Only a few people had ever crossed the threshold casually. Among those names was a man who initially drew little attention. Not a relative, not a business partner, not someone currently employed, a former helper. Years earlier, during a period of transition, the family had allowed him to stay temporarily. He had repaired fences, helped with livestock, slept in a spare room. He was quiet, grateful, invisible. Eventually, he left, or so everyone believed. What investigators later uncovered was that his departure had never been clean. There was no formal goodbye, no closure. He drifted away physically, but mentally remained anchored to the property. He remembered routines. He remembered silences. He remembered how the house sounded at night. And most importantly, he remembered how easily he had once been allowed inside. When police searched the property, they found no forced entry. Doors were unlocked, windows intact. Nothing suggested intrusion. The house had not been broken into. It had been re-entered. This realization reframed the entire case. The killer hadn't attacked a family from the outside. He had approached them from a place of familiarity, one built years earlier and never fully dismantled. In his mind, the house was not stolen property. It was reclaimed. Investigators would later describe the crime as one rooted in entitlement rather than anger. The killer did not see himself as taking something that wasn't his. He saw himself as correcting an imbalance. That belief shaped everything he did after the murders. It explained why he stayed, why he cooked, why he slept in their beds without hesitation, and why, when he finally decided to leave, he didn't do so silently. Because before walking away from the farm, he left something behind, a letter placed deliberately on the kitchen table, not hidden, not rushed, waiting. The letter was the last thing investigators touched. They documented the bodies first, photographed the rooms, measured distances, logged times, but no one opened the envelope on the kitchen table right away. It sat there, centered, aligned with the edge of the wood, as if someone had taken time to straighten it. That detail mattered. Criminals who panic don't align paper. When a forensic officer finally slid on gloves and lifted the envelope, he noticed something else. There were no visible fingerprints on the outside. Not smudged, not wiped, simply absent. The killer had planned for it to be read, not traced. Inside was a single page, handwritten. The pen pressure was steady, no shaking, no ink blotches where a hand hesitated. The first sentence stopped the room. "I stayed because no one ever asked me to leave." Detectives exchanged glances. This wasn't denial, it wasn't delusion. It was justification. The letter didn't describe the murders. It didn't list grievances in the way angry manifestos often do. Instead, it read like a personal explanation addressed to no one in particular, as if the writer expected understanding rather than forgiveness. He wrote about the farm as if it were a shared space, not a private one. He referred to rooms by function, not ownership. The kitchen, not their kitchen. The bedroom, not their bedroom. Language revealed belief. One passage stood out immediately. "They locked me out without ever telling me why. I waited for them to explain. They never did. So I stayed long enough to understand." Investigators recognized something dangerous in that sentence. The killer didn't believe he was rejected. He believed he was ignored. That distinction shifted the profile entirely. People who feel rejected lash out. People who feel ignored rewrite reality to include themselves. The letter continued, detailing the days he spent on the farm after the murders. He described feeding the animals, repairing a broken hinge on the barn door, cleaning the house. "These things still needed to be done," he wrote. "They always needed me to do them." He wasn't hiding what he'd done. He was reframing it. The murders were never presented as acts of violence. They were positioned as consequences, inevitable outcomes of a situation he believed had been mishandled. One detective underlined a line twice. "They forgot who kept this place alive when no one else was looking." The investigation pivoted sharply. This was no longer about identifying a suspect through opportunity alone. It was about reconstructing a relationship that had never officially existed, but had been emotionally real to one person. Detectives revisited the family's history with the former helper. They spoke to extended relatives, business associates, old neighbors. Slowly a pattern emerged. The man had never been formally employed for long periods. He drifted in and out, helped during busy seasons, disappeared when not needed. To the family, he was temporary. To him, the farm was permanent. Witnesses recalled moments that hadn't seemed important at the time. How he spoke possessively about the land, how he lingered after tasks were completed, how he grew distant when boundaries were reinforced. No one remembered him being aggressive. They remembered him being quiet. Quiet people are rarely reported. Police eventually traced his movements in the days after he left the farm. He hadn't rushed. He hadn't crossed state lines immediately. He traveled slowly, deliberately, staying in places where no one would question his presence, just like the farm. For days, investigators believed they were close to finding him. Sightings were reported, tips came in, but each lead dissolved under scrutiny. The killer wasn't hiding. He was blending. The letter's final paragraph revealed why. "I know they'll call me a stranger," he wrote, "but strangers don't know where you keep your tools. Strangers don't know which floorboard creaks. Strangers don't wait." That sentence reframed everything. The killer didn't see himself as an intruder who overstayed. He saw the family as hosts who failed their obligation. And in his logic, hosts who abandon guests lose their claim to the house. The letter ended without a signature. No name, no date. Just one final line written smaller than the rest. "I left because there was nothing left for me to do." That line haunted the investigation, because it implied completion, not escape. Police released portions of the letter to the public, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting, the phrasing, the mindset. Psychologists weighed in. Analysts debated whether the killer would strike again. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. He hadn't killed to feel powerful. He had killed to feel acknowledged, and once that acknowledgement was secured, once he had lived out his belief that he belonged, the urge was gone. Weeks passed, then months. The killer was never found. The farm was sold quietly, demolished later. Locals said the land felt wrong afterward, not haunted but emptied, as if something unfinished had simply moved on. The case file was eventually marked inactive. But among detectives, the letter continued to circulate, not as evidence, as a warning, because it showed how easily familiarity can become entitlement, how silence can be interpreted as permission, and how crimes within families often grow not from hatred, but from relationships that were never clearly defined. The killer didn't flee in panic. He walked away believing the chapter was closed, and in doing so, he left behind a truth far more unsettling than the letter itself. Sometimes the most dangerous person is not the one who breaks in. It's the one who was never fully told to leave. The mistake wasn't procedural. That was the conclusion internal reviewers reached months later, after timelines were reconstructed and protocols reread with the benefit of distance. Every checklist had been followed, every call made within the expected window, evidence logged correctly. The failure lived somewhere less measurable. It lived in assumption. From the beginning, investigators treated the crime as something that ended when the killer left the farm. The letter reinforced that belief. It framed the murders as a closed narrative, an act with a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion written by the perpetrator himself. Police accepted that framing without realizing it. Search efforts focused outward, not backward. They looked for movement, not roots. Borders, not history. Roots, not relationships. The assumption was simple. Someone capable of staying that long would eventually slip. He never did, because he didn't need to run. The man understood something most criminals don't. Disappearance doesn't require speed. It requires plausibility. He moved in ways that didn't invite scrutiny. He took short trips, used cash when it was normal to do so, slept where transient presence was expected. And crucially, he didn't carry the crime with him. He left it behind, both physically and psychologically. Investigators later realized that nothing in the letter suggested future intent. No threats, no unresolved grievances, no fixation beyond the farm. The killer wasn't searching for his next target. He believed he had already resolved the imbalance. That belief shaped the investigation's blind spot. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors, delivery drivers, seasonal workers, anyone who might have seen him after the murders. Several people recalled encounters that felt ordinary at the time. A man asking for directions, a man purchasing supplies, a man who lingered just long enough to be remembered, but not enough to be suspicious. Each recollection came too late. The killer had chosen environments where presence was never questioned. That pattern mirrored his time on the farm. He hadn't been dangerous because he hid. He had been dangerous because he fit. As the case stalled, internal discussion shifted toward accountability. How had someone with that level of familiarity been overlooked? Why had no one flagged the former helper earlier? The answer was uncomfortable. He had never done anything that required documentation, no criminal record, no formal employment termination, no reported conflict. He existed in the administrative gaps where people often disappear without consequence. Those gaps are where crimes within families often gestate. The family had never considered him a threat because they had never considered him significant. To them, he was temporary help. To him, he was foundational. That asymmetry proved fatal. When investigators finally tracked down relatives of the former helper, they encountered a familiar refrain. He talked about the farm like it was his, one sibling said, not in an angry way, just assumed. Another relative recalled a conversation that suddenly carried new weight. He once said, "Some people think they own land just because they inherited papers. I didn't think anything of it. At the time, it sounded like bitterness. Now, it sounded like philosophy." Psychologists consulting on the case highlighted a critical detail. The killer didn't exhibit signs of impulse-driven violence. His actions were slow, deliberate, and framed internally as correction rather than revenge. That mindset is harder to detect and harder to stop because it doesn't announce itself. The investigation also revealed something else the letter had quietly exposed. The killer had monitored the family long after leaving the farm. He knew when staff visits decreased. He knew which routines became irregular. He knew when isolation deepened. That knowledge didn't come from stalking in the traditional sense. It came from entitlement. He felt justified in keeping watch. When police reviewed financial records, they found no motive rooted in money. The family's wealth remained untouched. The killer hadn't benefited materially from the crime. That absence of gain confused early profiling efforts, but later analysis reframed it entirely. This wasn't theft. It was replacement. The killer didn't want what the family owned. He wanted the role he believed he once played. And in his logic, the family had disqualified themselves. As weeks turned into months, pressure mounted to deliver closure. Media interest flared briefly, then faded. Without a suspect in custody, the case slipped from headlines into archives. Internally, detectives debated whether the letter should ever have been released. Some believed it empowered the killer by validating his narrative. Others argued it was the only window into his thinking. Both were right. The letter clarified motive, but it also granted the killer the last word. That mattered, because crimes like this don't end when bodies are found. They end when meaning is denied. And in this case, the killer had controlled the meaning, by staying, by writing, by leaving on his terms. Years later, a detective who had worked the case would say something quietly during an interview that never aired. "He didn't escape," the detective said. "He finished." That statement captured the true failure of the investigation. The killer didn't feel pursued. He felt complete. And completeness is the most difficult state to disrupt. The farm no longer exists. The land changed hands, then hands again. New owners never learned the full story. They only knew something had happened and that it was better not to ask. But for those who studied the case, one lesson remained unavoidable. Crimes within families rarely begin with violence. They begin with silence, with boundaries never stated, with roles assumed rather than defined. And sometimes the most dangerous decision isn't who you let in, it's who you never clearly tell has to leave. The error was small enough to hide in plain sight. It didn't involve a missed warrant, a failed interview, or a corrupted piece of evidence. It happened earlier, quietly, during the first 48 hours after the murders, when the crime scene was still being understood and assumptions were hardening into direction. Police had secured the farmhouse and the immediate perimeter, but they treated the surrounding land as background rather than evidence. Acres of fields, outbuildings, tree lines, and access paths were catalogued broadly, not examined with the same precision as the interior rooms. That decision mattered. The killer had not remained inside the house the entire time he stayed. He moved outward, testing boundaries, mapping visibility, confirming who noticed and who didn't. He treated the property the way someone does when they are reacquainting themselves with a place they believe they know. Investigators later found faint indicators that had gone unnoticed. Boot impressions near a rarely used equipment shed, a gate latch adjusted by hand rather than machinery, a trail through tall grass that suggested repeated foot traffic rather than animal movement. Individually, none of these details were alarming. Together they formed a picture of someone rehearsing departure. When police finally expanded their search radius, the rehearsal had already paid off. A critical opportunity was missed on the second day. A state trooper stopped a man on a rural road roughly 12 miles from the farm. The stop was routine, an equipment light malfunction on an older truck. The man complied calmly, answered questions without hesitation, and produced identification that raised no flag. The trooper noted something unusual later, but dismissed it at the time. The man knew the local roads exceptionally well, including secondary paths not commonly used by travelers. At that moment, the farm murders had not yet been publicly connected to a suspect description. The trooper let him go. By the time the connection was made, the man was already gone. Investigators reviewed the stop weeks later and realized what had slipped through. The killer had not fled randomly. He had exited along routes he had memorized long before the crime. That knowledge didn't come from planning the murders. It came from belonging there once. The investigation team re-evaluated the timeline with this in mind. They realized the killer had likely chosen the moment to leave, based not on urgency, but on certainty, waiting until he felt the environment had fully accepted his presence as normal. Only then did he move. This reframed the letter yet again. I left because there was nothing left for me to do. Investigators had read that as emotional closure. Now it read as operational. He left when the window closed. The letter wasn't just explanation. It was documentation of a completed process. When detectives attempted to reconstruct his final movements, they encountered another obstacle. The killer had deliberately avoided creating a narrative trail. He didn't contact anyone, didn't seek attention, didn't insert himself into conversations about the crime. He understood something deeply unsettling. Attention creates pattern, pattern creates prediction, and prediction creates capture. So he stayed uninteresting. That strategy worked. As months passed, the case became a teaching example inside law enforcement circles, not for what was done wrong in a dramatic sense, but for how familiarity distorts threat assessment. Officers noted that the killer's prior proximity to the family had created a blind zone. He was remembered as helpful, quiet, peripheral. That memory inoculated him against suspicion. By the time the possibility of entitlement-driven violence was fully understood, it was too late. The man had vanished into a role that suited him, someone who belonged nowhere officially. That role is nearly impossible to pursue. One investigator summarized it privately. You can't hunt someone who doesn't feel hunted. Years later, the letter remained the most studied piece of the case, not because it revealed identity, but because it exposed mindset. Training programs began using redacted excerpts to demonstrate how justification can masquerade as calm reasoning. Recruits were taught to look for language that reframes harm as maintenance, violence as correction, presence as right. The family's story faded from public memory, but among those who had worked the case, it never fully closed. Not because of the unanswered question of who the killer was, but because of the answered question of why he succeeded. He wasn't smarter than the system. He was quieter than it expected. The farm's demolition marked the final physical erasure of the crime scene. No marker, no memorial. Just land repurposed, soil turned, history flattened. But the lesson remained intact. Crimes within families often succeed not through force, but through assumption, through roles left undefined, through people who are never told, clearly and finally, where they stand. The killer didn't vanish because the police failed to look hard enough. He vanished because for years no one had looked at him closely at all. And that, more than the letter, was the truth he left behind. The letter changed how the case was remembered, but not how it was investigated. Once the immediate search stalled, the file moved into a different phase: interpretation. Analysts, psychologists, and senior investigators were brought in not to find the killer, but to understand what the crime meant. That distinction mattered because meaning influences how future cases are recognized or missed. The family's wealth became a focal point, not as a motive for theft, but as a catalyst for distance. They owned land, not community, influence, not intimacy. Their interactions with others were functional, bounded, transactional. Help was accepted when needed and dismissed when not. That pattern, harmless in ordinary life, had created an emotional vacuum the killer stepped into years earlier. Investigators reconstructed the early relationship between the family and the former helper with uncomfortable clarity. He had arrived during a period when the farm required extra labor, repairs, seasonal work, routine maintenance that strained the family's usual arrangements. He was efficient, unobtrusive, and willing to stay late. He filled gaps without asking questions. To the family, he was useful. To him, usefulness felt like belonging. The problem was never the work. It was the silence that followed. When the busy period ended, there was no conversation about transition, no acknowledgement of contribution, no clear statement of boundaries. He was simply no longer needed, and that absence of closure lingered. Psychologists reviewing the case later noted that entitlement-based violence often originates not in mistreatment, but in unresolved attachment. The killer had not been humiliated or exploited. He had been left undefined. That ambiguity became the foundation of his later justification. When police interviewed extended family members, they discovered something else that had gone unnoticed: internal fractures, disagreements about land use, quiet resentments about inheritance, conversations that stopped just short of confrontation. Nothing criminal, but enough tension to create an atmosphere where emotional clarity was avoided. The killer didn't create that environment. He exploited it. One detective described the dynamic bluntly. He entered a family that already avoided saying hard things. That avoidance became lethal. As the investigation deepened, analysts noticed the killer's behavior after the murders followed a specific pattern: normalization. He didn't isolate himself. He didn't behave furtively. He performed routines that mirrored those of the family before their deaths. This wasn't mimicry for deception. It was continuity. He acted as if the house had transitioned ownership naturally, not violently. That mindset explained why he stayed for days without fear. In his internal narrative, he wasn't a criminal awaiting discovery. He was a caretaker restoring order. The letter, when reread with this framework, became even more disturbing. It didn't seek validation from law enforcement or the public. It sought alignment. It assumed the reader would eventually understand, if not agree. That assumption revealed a dangerous confidence. He believed his logic was transferable, which raised a troubling question among investigators. If he believed this once, could he believe it again somewhere else? The answer was unclear. There were no subsequent crimes with a similar signature, no reports of someone staying in a home after killing its occupants, no letters, no repetitions. That absence suggested something critical. This wasn't a pattern killer. It was a situational one. The crime did not emerge from a general urge to harm, but from a specific relationship that had curdled over time. Remove the relationship, and the violence did not replicate. That realization brought no comfort. Because it meant prevention depended not on spotting criminals, but on recognizing unresolved dynamics long before they reached a breaking point. As the case aged, it entered training manuals under a neutral title: Delayed Discovery Homicide with Post-Offense Habitation. The language stripped away the human cost in favor of classification, but among detectives who had seen the house, the classification felt inadequate. They remembered the kitchen table, the aligned envelope, the sense that the killer hadn't been hiding, but waiting. One investigator admitted years later that the most haunting aspect of the case wasn't the murders. It was the thought that, had someone arrived unexpectedly during those days, had a neighbor stopped by, had a worker returned, the killer likely would have answered the door, calmly, and been believed. That possibility forced law enforcement to confront an uncomfortable truth. Trust is often extended based on familiarity, not verification, and familiarity can be manufactured over time. The farm had not been protected by locks or alarms. It had been protected by assumptions, and assumptions, once breached, offer no resistance. As the case moved toward archival status, one final internal review addressed a question that had lingered since the letter was found. Why did the killer leave it at all? If he wanted to disappear, why risk exposure? The conclusion reached was unsettling. The letter wasn't a risk, it was insurance. By defining the narrative, the killer reduced the chance of misinterpretation. He ensured the crime would be understood on his terms, limiting speculation that might provoke deeper pursuit. The letter anchored the story where he wanted it anchored, and it worked. The case never expanded beyond the farm. No broader search, no national manhunt, no lingering pressure, just a file, a lesson, and an absence. Crimes within families often end this way, not with justice, but with explanation. And explanation can feel deceptively complete. But the detectives who lived with the case knew better. Explanation is not resolution. It's simply the last thing a killer leaves behind. The impact of the case didn't surface immediately. It emerged slowly, in the way certain investigations follow detectives home, not through images, but through questions that refused to stay confined to paperwork. Long after the farm was demolished and the file archived, the case continued to alter how investigators interpreted quiet situations, familiar faces, and delayed discoveries. Several detectives involved later admitted the same thing. This case made them suspicious of normalcy. Before, calm scenes were reassuring. Afterward, calm became ambiguous. The aligned envelope on the table had changed that. In debriefings, senior investigators noticed a shift in language. Officers began describing scenes not just in terms of disorder or damage, but in terms of continuity. Was life interrupted, or did it appear to continue? Had routines stopped, or had they been taken over? That distinction was new. The killer's days on the farm forced law enforcement to confront a blind spot that statistics rarely capture. Crimes committed by people who don't see themselves as criminals. People who act from internal logic rather than emotional escalation. These offenders don't flee because they don't feel chased. They don't hide because they don't feel exposed. That mindset proved more difficult to profile than any impulsive behavior. One detective recalled reviewing a later unrelated case, a missing elderly couple in a suburban home. The house appeared orderly, mail collected, trash taken out, lights turned on at night. Before the farm case, officers might have assumed a voluntary absence. After it, they pushed for immediate entry. The couple was found alive. That outcome didn't make headlines, but within the department it mattered. The farm case had sharpened instincts that no training manual could teach. The letter itself became a tool, handled carefully, used sparingly. Recruits were shown excerpts not to frighten them, but to teach them how justification sounds when it wears the mask of calm explanation. "This is how violence looks when it believes it's reasonable," one instructor would say. The killer had never raised his voice on paper. That terrified people more than threats ever could. As years passed, the detectives who had worked the case noticed another subtle change in themselves. They began asking clearer questions in everyday life, setting firmer boundaries, closing conversations that felt unfinished, not out of paranoia, out of respect for definition. One investigator explained it best during a retirement interview. "We're taught to look for danger in chaos," he said. "But this case taught me danger can grow in comfort, in familiarity, in places where nothing seems urgent enough to address." The farm had been one of those places. It didn't look vulnerable, it looked settled. That illusion delayed discovery, allowed habitation, and ultimately gave the killer exactly what he needed: time without challenge. The case also influenced how delayed report crimes were handled. New protocols emphasized rapid assessment of post-offense activity, not just time of death. Officers were trained to ask not only when something happened, but who behaved as if nothing had happened afterward. That question changed everything. The killer had not vanished because he was clever. He vanished because he behaved like someone who had every right to be there. And people believed him. Years later, a junior detective asked a veteran why the case still came up in internal discussions, despite being officially closed. The veteran answered without hesitation, "Because it reminds us that the most dangerous words in an investigation are, 'Everything looks fine.' The farm no longer exists. The land has been divided, resold, repurposed. New owners know nothing of the family who once lived there, and nothing of the man who stayed after they were gone. But the absence left behind by the case persists, in policy, in practice, in memory. It changed how crimes within families were understood, not as explosions of rage, but as slow-burning failures of definition. Failures to say no clearly, failures to end relationships cleanly, failures to recognize when silence becomes permission. The killer never returned. No further letters surfaced, no similar crimes followed, which, in a way, confirmed the most unsettling conclusion of all. This was never about murder as an end. It was about resolution. The killer didn't want chaos. He wanted completion, and once he believed he had achieved it, he walked away, untouched, unchallenged, and unseen. For law enforcement, that truth lingered longer than any open file, because it meant justice wasn't always prevented by lack of evidence. Sometimes it was delayed by comfort, and comfort, when left unquestioned, can be as dangerous as any locked door left open. The community did not grieve loudly. There were no marches, no public vigils that drew attention beyond the county line. The family had lived quietly, and their absence settled in the same way, softly, unevenly, leaving behind a space that felt larger than expected. People noticed it in small ways. The farm road grew over with weeds faster than usual. The feed store stopped receiving its largest monthly order. A mechanic realized months later that no one had called to schedule the seasonal maintenance he'd done for years. Nothing announced itself as loss. Loss revealed itself through interruption. At first, neighbors spoke in cautious sentences. "It's a shame. Such a nice place." You never really know people. Conversations drifted away before anyone said anything too specific. The murders felt too intimate to discuss casually and too unresolved to confront directly. Then the house was sold. The decision came from distant relatives who wanted closure without proximity. They declined interviews, declined public statements, declined questions that had no answers. When contractors arrived to assess the property, they reported something odd, not supernatural, not dramatic, just unsettling. The house felt occupied, not in a spiritual sense, in a logistical one. Furniture arranged efficiently, tools stored with intention, systems maintained beyond necessity. It felt less like a crime scene and more like a place that had been managed. One contractor said later, "It didn't feel abandoned, it felt dismissed." That phrasing spread quietly among those who had seen the inside. The demolition happened quickly, no ceremony, no acknowledgement. The structure was taken down piece by piece, reduced to materials that could be reused or discarded without context. The kitchen table was smashed. The room where the letter had waited no longer existed. And yet the story didn't end with the building. It migrated. Over the years, fragments of the case surfaced in unexpected places, not as gossip, but as caution. Parents told their adult children to be clearer with boundaries. Landowners reconsidered long-term, informal arrangements. People who had once relied on familiarity as trust began asking questions they previously avoided. The crime didn't make people afraid, it made them precise. Law enforcement noticed this too. Calls reporting "something feels off" increased slightly, not in frequency but in seriousness. Officers began responding to situations that would once have been dismissed as nothing, and occasionally those instincts were right. A patrol officer later admitted that he'd thought of the farm case while responding to a wellness check at another rural property. The house looked orderly, too orderly. He insisted on entry. The occupant was alive, but not alone. That intervention never made the news, but it mattered. The farm case also reshaped how crimes within families were discussed publicly. Journalists covering similar incidents began avoiding sensational language. They focused instead on timelines, relationships, and the quiet decisions that preceded violence. One article described the farm murders not as a shocking act, but as the end of a conversation no one realized was still happening. That phrase circulated among investigators because it captured the truth more accurately than any headline. Years later, a criminology conference referenced the case during a panel on delayed discovery homicides. The speaker didn't mention names or locations. He described the killer's behavior in abstract terms: habitation, normalization, entitlement. When he finished, the room stayed quiet longer than usual. Someone in the audience finally asked, "How do you stop something like that?" The speaker didn't answer immediately. "You don't stop it at the crime scene," he said finally. "You stop it years earlier, when someone believes they belong somewhere without agreement." That answer unsettled people, because it suggested prevention wasn't about security systems or surveillance. It was about communication. The family's wealth had insulated them from certain dangers, but it had also reduced their need to confront discomfort. They didn't argue. They didn't explain. They didn't define endings. Those omissions felt harmless at the time. They weren't. As the case aged, the letter itself became harder to access. Portions were redacted further, copies restricted, not to protect the killer, but to prevent imitation of his narrative framing. Investigators had learned that language could inspire behavior as easily as action. The letter had given the killer coherence. No one wanted to offer that again. In the end, the most enduring impact of the crime wasn't fear or outrage. It was awareness, a recognition that violence doesn't always enter screaming. Sometimes it arrives quietly, waits patiently, and leaves only after it feels finished. The farm became an example, taught not as a mystery but as a warning. Familiarity can be mistaken for safety, silence for consent, and unfinished relationships for harmless history. And when those mistakes align, crimes within families don't look like invasions. They look like continuity, as if nothing changed at all. The decision that could have changed everything was discussed only once. It happened during an internal meeting in the early weeks of the investigation, before the case lost momentum, before the killer's trail cooled into abstraction. At the time, it sounded excessive. Later, it would sound inevitable. A senior investigator proposed a simple action: reclassify the former helper as a central figure rather than a peripheral contact, and issue a regional alert based on behavior, not identity. Not a warrant, not an accusation, a behavioral notice. The argument was straightforward. The killer's actions suggested entitlement, familiarity, and calm continuity. If those traits were circulated, if officers and local authorities were instructed to look for someone behaving as if nothing had happened in the immediate aftermath of a multiple homicide, then the net might tighten without relying on name or face. The proposal stalled. Legal concerns were raised. There was no probable cause. The letter, while disturbing, didn't constitute an admission under the standards required. No physical evidence tied the former helper conclusively to the crime scene. Issuing a behavioral alert risked public scrutiny and internal backlash. The decision was deferred. Deferred decisions, as the farm case would later demonstrate, often function as decisions themselves. By the time the idea resurfaced, the killer had already dissolved into environments where behavioral alerts would have blended into background noise. Shelters, temporary work, transient communities, where calm presence was unremarkable. The window had closed. That realization became the final entry in the internal review. Opportunity lost due to conservative thresholding. It was an understatement. The investigation officially wound down months later. Resources were reallocated. Detectives reassigned. The case was moved to inactive status with the quiet acknowledgement that it would likely never be solved. But closure did not follow. For the investigators most closely involved, the case left behind a persistent question, not about evidence, but about responsibility. Could clarity have prevented violence years earlier? Could a single conversation have interrupted the killer's internal narrative before it solidified into justification? Those questions had no procedural answers. They lingered in personal spaces. One detective recalled revisiting old cases in his spare time, searching for similar patterns. Former helpers, distant relatives, people who drifted in and out of family structures without formal endings. He didn't find another crime like the farm. What he found instead were dozens of near misses, situations where boundaries were clarified just in time, where assumptions were corrected, where someone was told, clearly and without ambiguity, that their role had ended. Those moments never made reports, but they mattered. The farm case became a reference point for something rarely documented: the cost of silence. Not malicious silence, not secrecy, the kind of silence born from discomfort, from avoiding conversations that feel unnecessary until they aren't. In the years that followed, departments quietly updated training language. They didn't mention the farm by name. They spoke instead about relationship closure and informal access risk. The language was dry, the lesson was not. Crimes within families often evade early detection because they don't announce conflict. They unfold inside relationships that appear resolved on the surface, but remain unresolved underneath. The killer had lived in that unresolved space for years. The letter he left behind was not a sudden creation. It was the final articulation of a belief system built slowly, reinforced by absence of correction. No one ever told him explicitly, "You no longer belong here." And in that vacuum, he told himself a different story. As time passed, the case stopped being cited in meetings. New crimes demanded attention. New patterns emerged. The farm receded into institutional memory. But among a small circle of investigators, the case retained a quiet gravity. One of them summarized it best during a conversation that never made it into any report. "We're trained to interrupt violence," he said, "but this taught me that sometimes the real work is interrupting certainty. Certainty that one is owed something. Certainty that silence equals approval. Certainty that presence does not require permission." The killer had acted not because he was uncertain, but because he was too sure. Sure of his place. Sure of his right. Sure that the family had failed a test only he believed existed. That certainty, once formed, proved resistant to evidence, logic, and consequence. And that is why the decision that could have changed everything didn't feel urgent at the time. Urgency rarely accompanies certainty. In the end, the case closed without arrests, without public reckoning, without resolution in the traditional sense. What it left behind was something harder to measure. A shift in how investigators listened to quiet scenes, a discomfort with environments that felt too normal, an awareness that danger does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it settles in, sometimes it waits, sometimes it leaves only after it feels finished. The farm is gone, the letter is archived, the killer remains unnamed. But the lesson endures. Not as a warning shouted from headlines, but as a rule spoken softly among those who learned it the hard way. When relationships end without clarity, They don't always end. And when someone decides they still belong, silence may be the most dangerous response of all. The official closure of the case arrived without ceremony. A short memo circulated through the department, stamped and signed, reclassifying the investigation as inactive due to lack of actionable leads. No suspect named, no charges filed, no further resources allocated. The language was clinical, almost apologetic, as if acknowledging that the system had reached the edge of what it could justify pursuing. For the family, there was no notification beyond a formal letter to distant relatives. The wording expressed regret, commitment to future review if new information emerged, and appreciation for cooperation. It did not explain why the killer had been able to stay. It did not address the letter. It did not attempt to offer meaning. Meaning, by then, had become the most dangerous thing to mishandle. Inside the department, the case file was boxed and labeled, but it was not forgotten. Detectives returned to it privately, pulling it from shelves late at night, reading the letter again with new eyes, wondering if something subtle had been missed. Each time, the conclusion was the same. Nothing had been missed in the way crimes are usually missed. There was no hidden witness, no overlooked camera, no suppressed confession. The killer had not escaped because of a clever trick or a single error. He had escaped because the environment allowed him to believe for years that no one would challenge his presence. That realization changed how some investigators lived their own lives. One detective admitted that after the case, he became uncomfortable with open-ended arrangements. He ended favors cleanly. He clarified expectations. He said goodbye when goodbye was required. Another said the case made him rethink how families handle separation, how people drift out of roles without conversation, assuming distance alone is enough. It isn't, he said. Distance doesn't end anything. It just delays the reckoning. The letter, meanwhile, continued to exist in a strange limbo. It was neither evidence nor confession, neither threat nor apology. It occupied a category all its own, narrative control. Legal experts debated whether releasing more of it could generate new leads. Psychologists warned against it. They argued the letter's power lay in how calmly it justified violence, and that repeating it risked normalizing the logic behind it. Ultimately, the decision was made to restrict it further, not to protect the killer, to protect interpretation. Because once people begin debating whether a crime made sense to the person who committed it, the line between understanding and validation becomes dangerously thin. Years passed. The farm became a footnote. New cases took priority. New tragedies demanded attention. For most people, the story faded into the vast background noise of unsolved crimes. But among those who had been close to it, the case remained uniquely unsettling. Not because it was unresolved, because it felt resolved by the wrong person. The killer had chosen the ending. He had decided when the story was complete, when to leave, and what explanation would remain behind. The system had been forced to accept that ending after the fact. That inversion, where the perpetrator controls closure, sat poorly with everyone who believed justice required something else. In one internal seminar years later, a senior investigator addressed the case indirectly. He spoke about crimes that don't escalate, crimes that don't repeat, crimes that don't fit into cycles. "These are the ones that haunt you," he said, "because they don't announce themselves as monsters. They look like someone tying up loose ends." That description captured the farm case perfectly. The killer had not acted impulsively. He had acted deliberately, patiently, and with a sense of finality that made pursuit feel almost inappropriate. As if he had already left the building before anyone realized a crime had occurred. The most disturbing part, investigators agreed, was imagining how easily the outcome could have been different. Not through arrest, through acknowledgement. If, years earlier, someone had told him clearly, "Your time here is over, you do not belong." If that boundary had been stated plainly, documented, reinforced, Would the violence still have happened? No one could say for certain. But the absence of that moment, the clean ending that never occurred, loomed large in every analysis. Crimes within families often resist simple motives. They don't arise from hatred alone. They grow from expectation, from emotional debts that exist only in one person's mind. The farm case illustrated that danger with brutal clarity. The killer did not see himself as destroying a family. He saw himself as concluding a relationship. That belief insulated him from panic, from remorse, and from the need to flee. And that insulation made him invisible. As the case aged, it quietly influenced how departments across the region handled similar situations. Officers were encouraged to look beyond criminal records and focus on relational histories. Who had been around? Who had drifted away without explanation? Who spoke about a place as if ownership were emotional rather than legal? These questions didn't solve crimes retroactively, but they prevented a few. That was the uncomfortable legacy of the farm. No arrest, no justice in the traditional sense, only awareness sharpened by loss, and a final understanding that stayed with everyone who learned the details. Some crimes don't end because the perpetrator escapes. They end because the perpetrator believes the story is finished. And when that belief goes unchallenged for long enough, it can become deadly. The unanswered questions didn't fade with time. They hardened. Years after the case was closed, detectives who had worked it could still recall precise details. The way the envelope sat on the table, the absence of haste in the house, the sense that the killer had not fled but concluded. Memory clung to those moments because they resisted categorization. Most crimes leave debris. This one left intention. When the department conducted its final archival review, a junior analyst raised a question that had never been formally addressed. Why didn't the killer take anything to remember the place by? No objects were missing, no photographs, no documents, not even something trivial. The answer, when it came, was chillingly simple. He didn't need souvenirs. The farm had never been about possession. It had been about recognition. Once he believed that recognition was complete, once he had lived there without challenge, nothing else was required. That realization reframed the killer's disappearance one last time. He didn't vanish into anonymity. He returned to it. People like him do not seek new identities. They seek environments where identity is irrelevant, places where presence is accepted without explanation. Temporary work, informal arrangements, communities built on tolerance rather than inquiry. In those spaces, certainty survives unchallenged. Occasionally, law enforcement would receive a tip that briefly reignited interest. A man resembling descriptions seen years later in another rural area, a similar tone in a handwritten note found at an unrelated scene. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny, not because the tips were wrong, but because the pattern was unique. The killer hadn't repeated himself. That was perhaps the most difficult truth for investigators to accept. Violence had not become his method. It had been his solution. Once implemented, it did not need reinforcement. Psychological consultants eventually concluded that the killer's internal narrative had achieved closure. He did not see himself as a criminal who had escaped justice. He saw himself as someone who had corrected a situation and moved on. That belief insulated him from guilt and from compulsion. He did not need to revisit the act. For the family's distant relatives, the absence of justice took a different form. They avoided public discussion, declined interviews, and chose privacy over resolution. Their grief was complicated by distance and by the unsettling awareness that the person responsible had once been welcomed. They did not ask how it happened. They asked when it began. And the answer, years earlier, quietly, offered no comfort. As time passed, the case became a reference point outside law enforcement as well. Therapists cited it when discussing boundary erosion. Legal scholars referenced it in conversations about informal access and liability. Community organizers used it as an example of why clarity matters more than politeness. The story migrated away from crime and into culture, not loudly, persistently. One of the original investigators once described the case as a lesson disguised as a mystery. He meant that the absence of resolution forced people to confront what they would otherwise ignore. The killer was never caught, but he was understood. And that understanding carried its own burden. Understanding meant acknowledging that the crime had not required extraordinary malice. It had required time, silence, and a belief left unchecked. That belief, I belong here even if no one says so, was the real weapon. The farm, the letter, the days of habitation, they were expressions of that belief, not its cause. In the final internal memo attached to the file, a senior reviewer wrote a sentence that would never be quoted publicly. Some crimes are prevented not by force, but by clarity. The memo went on to recommend that departments treat unresolved access with the same seriousness as physical vulnerability. Who has been here before? Who still speaks as if they are part of the place? Who was never formally told their role had ended? Those questions, once ignored, now became routine. The case never reopened. No dramatic breakthrough arrived decades later. No confession surfaced, and perhaps that was fitting, because the most disturbing aspect of the crime was never its mystery. It was its logic. The killer did not feel chased because he did not feel wrong. He did not hide because he did not feel exposed. He did not repeat the act because he did not feel unfinished. That combination is rare, and it is dangerous precisely because it does not announce itself. The story of the farm does not end with justice or retribution. It ends with awareness, quiet, uncomfortable, necessary. Awareness that violence does not always come from anger, that danger does not always come from strangers. And that silence, when left to define relationships, can be interpreted as consent. The killer walked away believing the chapter was closed. The rest of the world was left to learn why it should never have been opened in the first place. This case never asked to be solved. That is what makes it so unsettling. There were no hidden puzzles, no elaborate cover-ups, no brilliant escape plan waiting to be uncovered. What allowed the killer to disappear wasn't intelligence or luck, it was acceptance. Quiet, unexamined acceptance. He stayed because no one questioned his presence. He left because no one challenged his conclusion. The letter was not a confession. It was a boundary drawn too late. By the time it was read, the story had already ended, on his terms. The system didn't fail because it missed a detail. It failed because it inherited a narrative that had been quietly forming for years. Crimes within families rarely begin with violence. They begin with assumptions, with relationships that fade without clarity, with people who are never clearly told where they stand. In this case, silence became permission, familiarity became access, and entitlement grew unnoticed until it no longer needed permission at all. The killer was never caught, but he was not hiding. He walked away believing the chapter was complete. And that is the hardest truth to accept. Some crimes don't leave open endings because the perpetrator escapes, but because they believe nothing remains unresolved. If this story stayed with you, that's because it reflects something uncomfortable but real. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits at the table, waits its turn, and leaves only after it feels finished. If you want more stories that explore crimes hidden inside families, relationships, and unspoken boundaries, subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Because understanding how these crimes begin is the only way to recognize them before they end.